Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samach Vav, Daf 66 of Masechta Pesachim. It's a pretty awesome Daf. The first part of the Daf discusses how Hillel became the nasi, how he was appointed to be the nasi, which is super interesting. Hillel lived in the last 100 years of the second Beis Hamikdash, and he was the last of the Zugos with Shammai, and the Gemara here discusses how exactly he came to be nasi, which is an interesting story. And then on the continuation, after that we get to some interesting Agadatas as well as then at the end a discussion about Pesach sheni. So, pretty interesting daf overall. Let's get started. Daf Samach Vav Amud Aleph, where the Gemara begins about 10 lines into the page. Taner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught Alachazonis Alma Mibnei Beseira. Very, 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 very interesting stuff. So, this halacha was forgotten from Bnei Beseira. What halacha? So yesterday we learned in the Mishnah that when Pesach falls out on Shabbos, so if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, so you can offer the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. You could shecht it. It was machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva about what about the sort of meta things, the Rabbanans. With this halacha that you're allowed to offer the Korban Pesach on Shabbos was forgotten from the Bnei Beseira. They forgot the halacha. And first of all, who were the Bnei Beseira, which is also extremely interesting. So Rashi says Nasiim Hayu. They were nasis, which means that they were after Shmaya and Avtalion, but Kilu before Hillel. It sounds like so the Bnei Beseira were definitely during the time of Hillel, which is interesting because it puts it in perspective. Like they were super early. They were during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the Bnei Beseira, and also they were, as Rashi says in another place, he says Shayu Roshe Eretz Yisrael. They were the heads of Eretz Yisrael. So apparently, around the time of Hillel, before Hillel became the nasi, and it sounds like probably after Shmaya and Avtalion, somewhere in between there were these Bnei Beseira, who were the heads of Israel, which is super interesting. So one time, the 14th day of Nisan fell out on Shabbos. Now, I understand it to be that it was going to fall out on Shabbos, like it wasn't actually on Shabbos. It sounds like maybe it was Friday or something. Okay, but Erev Pesach was going to be on Shabbos. And the Bnei Beseira, they didn't know, they forgot. Because also, remember, back then nothing was written down. There was no Shulchan Aruch. It was still Baal Peh. It was before Rebbe. It was a while before Rebbe. At least 100 years. Maybe 150. So like things weren't written down. And they forgot the halacha. So they forgot if Pesach is docha Shabbos or not. So they said, well, does anybody know? What do we do? Is there anybody who knows if Korban Pesach is docha Shabbos or not? So they said to them, Adam echad yesh she'ala mibavel v'hillel habavli shmo sheshimesh negedol ador shmai v'avtayon. Wow. So they said, well, there's a certain Babylonian, and his name is Hillel habavli. Hillel was initially from Bavel, and sheshimesh negedol ador shmai v'avtayon. That of course we know what Shimush Talmidei Chachamim is from Masechta Brachos. That he basically studied Gemara with Shmai and Avtalion, that he learned with Shmaya and Avtalion, V'yodeh and Pesach dochas Shabbos and Lav, and he definitely knows if the Korban Pesach is dochas Shabbos. Shalchu v'karulo, so they sent to Hillel and they called him. Amrulo, they said to him, Klum atirdeim ha-Pesach dochas Shabbos and Lav. Do you know if offering the Korban Pesach is dochas Shabbos? Amrulem v'chi Pesach echad yesh lanu b'shana shedochas Shabbos. So he said, well, is Pesach such an exception? Do we only have one example of a Korban Pesach throughout the year that would potentially be docha Shabbos? There's more than 200 Korban Pesachs that are docha Shabbos every year. They said to him, he said, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean that there's 200 Pesachs that are docha Shabbos? He says, well, it says the word Mo'ado by Korban Pesach, but it also says the word Mo'ado by the Korban Tamid. Well, just like, so it says Moado by Pesach, it says Moado by the Tamid. Just like the Moado by the Tamid is Docha Shabbos, also the Moado by Pesach is Docha Shabbos. Meaning, the Korban Tamid, of course, is the offering that they would bring every day in the Beis HaMikdash without fail, morning and afternoon, whether it's during the week, whether it's on Shabbos. And now, in addition to the Korbanos of Shabbos, there's also the Musafs, right? There are other Korbanos. So if we have every Shabbos, the Korban Tamid in the morning and the afternoon, that's already 100 Korbanos, plus the 2 Korban Musafs that they bring every Shabbos. That's already plenty, or the 1 Korban Musaf, no, the 2 Korban Musafs, I think, that they bring every Shabbos. So that's already another 200, another 100. So there's your 200 Korbanos, and then plus other Yom Tovim and things like that. So, just like it says Moado by Korban Pesach, and it says Moado by Korban Tamid. So, just like the Korban Tamid is Docha Shabbos, so also Korban Pesach is Docha Shabbos V'od. And then Hillel continues and he says, Kal v'chomer, I could learn it out logically. Well, if the Korban Tamid, which there's no punishment of karis associated with it, and yet it's Docha Shabbos, Pesach shanush karis, and udin shedocha Shabbos. Well, the Korban Pesach, which has a chiyuv karis with it, if you don't offer the Korban Pesach, you chayiv karis, then certainly it should be Docha Shabbos miyado shivu birosh uminu nasi aleim. So immediately they made him the leader and they made him the nasi. Super interesting. So that's how Hillel became the nasi. This one time when they didn't know if Pesach fell out on Shabbos, and he was the one who knew, and then they appointed him as their leader, V'hayadoresh kol hayom kulo b'ilchos Pesach, and then he sat there and was teaching the halachos of Pesach all day. And then he started belittling them a little bit. And he said to them, what caused this predicament where you have some Babylonian coming from Bavel, and now he becomes the leader of Eretz Yisrael? It's because you're lazy. You had here in Eretz Yisrael Shmai and Avtalion, and you just left them there. You didn't study with them, and you left it up to me, a fellow from Babylonia, to come to Eretz Yisrael and study with Shmai and Avtalion and learn from them and become the leader. But it's only because you guys are lazy. Okay, fine. Amrulo, they said to Hillel, okay, nonetheless, Shachach v'lo hevi sakin me'ev Shabbos ma'u. We have a halachic question. So, Shechting the Korban Pesach is Docha Shabbos. What about the Meta? What about the Machshirei Korban Pesach? What if you forgot to bring a knife? So then, can you bring a knife? It sounds like everybody, I guess, would bring their own knife to slaughter the Korban Pesach, I guess. So if you didn't bring your knife to the Beis HaMikdash, so then what? Can you bring it with you on Shabbos? Amr len, halacha zo shemati v'shachachti. He says, okay, look, I actually forgot this halacha. Which is actually interesting, because it's in the context of a whole story that talks about how Bnei B'Seira forgot halacha and Hillel remembered it. Now Hillel forgot halacha. So maybe they should make somebody else the nasi now. Anyways, but as we'll see, that there's no particular person who knew the answer. Super interesting answer. So then Hillel says, you know what? I forgot the answer about what to do if you forgot to bring your knife when the Korban Pesach is Docha Shabbos. But, how about this? Let's wait and see. Leave it to the Yidden. The Yidden as a community, they collectively know the answer. Hanachlen li Yisrael, leave it to the Yidden. If they aren't prophets, well, Bnei Nevi'im hein. They're at least the children of prophets. Let's see what they do. I'm certain that they will intuit the correct answer. L'machar mishapischol tale tochvo b'tzmaro mishapischol gedi tochvo ben karnav. So they waited until the next day, until it was Shabbos, and everyone was coming to the Beis HaMikdash to slaughter their Korban Pesach, and they noticed that if you were bringing a Korban Pesach from a sheep, you took the knife and you stuck it into the wool of the sheep. And if you were bringing a goat, so then you put it between the horns of the goat. Hillel saw this and he remembered, aha, that's exactly it. This is exactly what I learned by Shmai and Avtayon, that when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos and you're slaughtering the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, if you forget to bring the knife, you could just attach it somehow to the animal and bring it in that way. Very, very interesting. We said earlier, so we had said earlier, how do we know that Pesach is Docha Shabbos? Well, it says Moado by the Korban Pesach, and it says Moado by the Korban Tamid. So just like it says Moado by the Korban Tamid, and the Korban Tamid is Docha Shabbos, so similarly it says Moado by Korban Pesach, so it must be that the Korban Pesach is also Docha Shabbos. V'tamid Gufei Minalan to Dochi Shabbos. Now how do we know that the Korban Tamid itself is Docha Shabbos? We're assuming that it is. How do we know? If it says well, it says Moado in its proper time, whenever that time is. Well, that can't be a good enough proof because Pesach Nami Yoksiv Be Moado. Well, Korban Pesach also says Moado, and we seem to not know that Korban Pesach is Docha Shabbos. We have to learn it out from Tamid. So it can't be from the fact that it simply says Moado. Ele Moado lo mashmalei, Hachanami Moado lo mashmalei. So it must be that by, I guess either Korban Pesach, I guess by Korban Pesach, he doesn't learn out that Moado means even on Shabbos, so therefore it must be that by Korban Tamid also Moado doesn't mean even on Shabbos. So then how do we know that Korban Tamid is Docha Shabbos? Selo Amakra, Ola Shabbos b'Shabbato, Al Ola Satomid. Interesting. So it says in the context of Korban Musaf on Shabbos, so it says Ola Shabbos b'Shabbato, you'll bring an Ola every single Shabbos, Al Ola Satomid, in addition to the Tamid that you're offering. Meaning, certainly the Korban Tamid you're going to be offering even on Shabbos, but then the Korban Musaf is in addition to that. So, Michlad Tamid Kreva b'Shabbos, implying that Memele, the Korban Tamid is brought, right? Meaning you bring the Korban Tamid every Shabbos. We seem to be just assuming that as a given. And then in addition to that, you bring the Korban Musaf. So there you have it. So the Korban Tamid is offered even on Shabbos. And then from Moado, we learn out that also the Korban Pesach is even offered on Shabbos. Amar Mai, we said earlier, Va'od Kavachomer. And in addition to the Gzeir Shava, we have a Kavachomer. Umatamid she'ein anush karis doches HaShabbos. Well, if the Korban Tamid, which there's no chiyuv karis associated with it, and yet it's doches Shabbos, Pesach shanush karis, enudin shedoches HaShabbos, well then certainly Korban Pesach, which has a chiyuv karis, if you don't offer it, certainly then it's more stringent and it should be doches Shabbos. But ikal mifrach, you can ask a question. I can argue that Tamid, the Korban Tamid, is actually more stringent because it's Tadir. It's every single day. So we don't miss a day. So even on Shabbos, Korban Pesach is once a year. You know, if that once a year falls out on Shabbos, maybe I can argue, do it, don't, it won't be Docha Shabbos. V'chalil, also the Korban Tamid is a Korban Ola, it's burnt entirely on the Mizbeach. As opposed to the Korban Pesach, where only some things, the Imurin, go on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara answers, well, Kavachomer Amalu Bereisha, Ufarchu Avadar Amalu Gzeir Shava. So the Gemara tries to answer that saying, you know what, you're right. Initially, Hillel had said the Kavachomer actually. They asked the questions that we just asked, that maybe Tamid is actually more Chomer, so maybe it's not a good proof. So then he told them the Gzeir Shava, that it says Moado by both of them. Well, if there was a Gzeir Shava, so why do we need a Kavachomer? A Gzeir Shava is much stronger than a Kavachomer. A Gzeir Shava, right, when it says the same word in two places, so, right, as we're going to see in a second, Ein Adam Dan Gzeir Shava Me'atzmo. You can't make up your own Gzeir Shavas, you have to have a tradition. And if you have a tradition for Gzeir Shava, as Rashi points out, since you have a Kabbalah, a tradition, that this can be learned, and the tradition goes back all the way, from teacher to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Har Sinai, so it's as if it's written mamish in the Torah. So Gzeir Shava is super strong. Kavachomer, anybody could make a logical argument, but then again, anybody could also disprove a logical argument. So therefore, if Hillel knew this Gezeira Shava, so why did he say it second? Why did he even bother with the logical arguments? So rather what Hillel was saying is Lididhu Ka'amar. He was saying Ka'amarlu. He was saying to them, look, Bishlomo Gezeira Shava lo gamrisu. So I understand you guys. I understand how you could have this question of is Pesach docha Shabbos or not? Because you don't have this Gezeira Shava to learn it out from Korban Tamid. Okay, I get that. You can't just make up your own Gezeira Shavas. However, but you at least should have learned out from the logical argument, from the Kavachomer, to say that if Pesach is a Chiyuv Karis, then certainly it should be Docha Shabbos. To which they responded, yeah, but it's actually not a good Kavachomer. It's actually not a good Kavachomer, because you could say, yeah, but Tamid is Tadir and it's Kalil, so maybe it's more stringent. That is why they didn't know the halacha. They didn't have the Gezeira Shava. The logical argument wasn't standing. That is where Hillel came in and said, yes, certainly, I have a tradition of a Gezeira Shava to teach that Pesach is Doche Shabbos. Okay, Zak the Gemara. Omer Mai, we said earlier, the Macher, that the next day, on Shabbos, Misha Pischo Tole Tochiv Lo Bitzmaro Gedi Tochiv Lo Ben Kainav, anybody whose Korban Pesach was a sheep, he took the knife and he put it in the wall. Anybody whose Korban Pesach was a goat, so he put it between the horns. How could you do that? If you set aside your animal to be a Korban Pesach, so it's Kodesh. It's Kodshim. And how can you be then sticking a knife in the wall and getting benefit from the animal? It's Me'ilah. So Hillel. So the answer is, well, they were doing like Hillel the Tanya on Mu'alav al Hillel. They said about Hillel, Miyamav Loma al Adam be'olaso, that during the tenure of Hillel, nobody ever violated, was over on Me'ilah B'Kachim. How? What they would do is they would bring the animal to the Azar before designating it as a korban, umakdisha, and then once it was in the Azara, that's when they would be makdish it. That's when they would say, okay, this is going to be a korban, and then they would do smicha, which is leaning on the animal before slaughtering it, and then they would slaughter the animal. So during the days of Hillel, they would delay being makdish the animal until they're already in the Azara, at which point you weren't going to be mo'il at that point anyways. So it's right before you're going to slaughter it. There isn't really a chance to get benefit from it. So therefore, when the fellows were bringing their knives to the Beis HaMikdash using their animals, they weren't yet makdish the animals, so therefore it wasn't Me'ilah. But Pesach b'Shabbos sechimatzi makdish lei. But one second, that sounds great. But when the Korban Pesach falls out on Shabbos, how can you be makdish the Korban Pesach on Shabbos? V'atanan, we learned in the Mishnah in Makdishin, we're not makdish, right? They say an animal that you're going to be a korban. Ve'in marichin, we don't evaluate, people. Arachin, to say that I'm going to give your value to the Beis HaMikdash. Ve'in machrimin, we don't, donate animals to the Beis HaMikdash. Ve'in magbin truma u'maisers, and we don't separate truma and meiser. Kol elu b'yom tov, they said, don't do this on Yom Tov, kavachom b'Shabbos, certainly not on Shabbos. So how could they be makdish their animals on Shabbos? I thought we don't do that. So the Gemara answers, Hanimile b'chovish she'ein kavur le'en zman. Now when we say that we're not makdish animals on Shabbos or Yom Tov, those are animals that don't have a specific time. Meaning, Shabbos is not the time to say to your animal, I'm going to offer you as a korban shlamim. That's not the time to do it. But if it's a korban that has a specific time, i.e., if today is Erev Pesach and you have to offer a korban Pesach today, you can be makdish your animal on Shabbos. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, as Rabbi Yochanan says, makdish adam is pischo b'Shabbos v'chagigaso b'Yom Tov. A person can be makdish a korban Pesach on Shabbos if the 14th day of Nisan falls out on Shabbos, and his korban chagiga, that when he goes to Yerushalayim for the holidays and he brings a korban chagiga, so that can be separated on Yom Tov. But the Gemara is not done yet. But one second, how can you bring these knives to the Beis Hamikdash while sort of like, let's say, stuck in the wool of the sheep. But that's what's called mechamer. Mechamer is when you lead an animal that is carrying something. So that would be what this is. Mechamer k'la'achar yad. So the Gemara answers, well, this is mechamer k'la'achar yad. This is not, transferring a knife in the wool of a sheep is not like a normal kind of thing. Maybe transferring, I don't know, some kind of a load on an animal, on like an ox. Yeah, I guess that's probably like more normal. But, taking a knife and sticking it into the wool of a sheep so you can bring it to the Beis Hamikdash is not a normal way of using an animal to like transfer things. So therefore, it's only also midrabanan, but nami. So the Gemara answers, but kilachar yad nami nidi isur d'oraisa like isur midrabanan me'ika. But still, it's also midrabanan. You can't just do things that are also midrabanan. So hainu dikabo mine. Well, b'diuk. That's exactly what they were asking Hillel. Davar sheyesh lo heter min haTorah, v'davar shvus omid lefanav le'akro kilachar yad. So what about a situation like this where mido oraisa is perfectly okay, and it's b'makom mitzvah, as the Gemara says. So meaning it's Erev Pesach, it's Shabbos. You have a mitzvah to bring the korban Pesach. You didn't bring your knife, or you don't have your knife in the Beis Hamikdash. You have to bring it with you. So now, in order to be able to shech the korban Pesach, you have to bring your knife. Now, midrabanan, they say that you're not allowed to be mechamer on Shabbos. So therefore, you can't bring the knife. But, so how do you relate with something which is also midrabanan? You're doing it kila'achar yad, in not its normal way. It's not a common thing, as Rashi points out. And if we say that you're not allowed to do this, then that also means that you're not going to be bringing your korban Pesach. So what do? Can we say, look, the shvus can be waived so that we can offer the korban Pesach? So what do? So Amullah, so we said to them, halachos o shamaiti v'shachachti. He says, look, I heard this specific halacha, but I forgot. Rather, let's just wait and see what the Yidden do, because if they aren't prophets, they're the children of prophets. Let's see what they intuit on their own to do. And then when he saw that they were sticking their knives into their the wool of their sheep or between the horns of their goats and taking it to the Beis Hamikdash that way, he said, aha, that's exactly the solution. If you have a person who's haughty, so if he's a chacham, if he's a wise person, so then he's going to lose his wisdom. If he is a prophet person, he's going to lose his prophecy. So how do we know that if he's a chacham, he will lose his wisdom? Well, from Hillel. Well, we see that we said earlier that Hillel was sort of giving them a hard time. And he was saying, how come I, the Babylonian, had to come here to Eretz Yisrael and become the leader? It's because you guys are lazy. So he was kind of giving them a shtickle musar. Well, I guess the Gemara is putting it in the context of he was being haughty. And then he had to say, I actually forgot this question that you asked me. So he kind of lost his wisdom, which is interesting also because we learned in Masechta Shabbos. What was that? Daf Lamed Aleph or something? No, Lamed Amud Aleph. I think maybe Lamed Amud Aleph. Somewhere over there. All those stories about Hillel, about how he was so patient and humble. And here he is, the example of how to know that somebody who's haughty will forget his wisdom. Interesting. Anyways, I don't know. I assume that he wasn't generally haughty, but there is this case, I guess. How do we know that if this person is a prophet, they will lose their prophecy? Midvora, from the prophetess Devora. She says that like all the roads and everything was becoming a mess. She was saying that there was no leadership in Israel until Devora came. And then it has to say, wake up, Devora, wake up and sing your song. We want to say that, well, because she somehow became quiet after being misyaher, after being haughty, to say that they needed her to come and save them. and then she kind of lost her prophecy, but then she had to be woken up again. Rish Lakish Amar says, Rish Lakish called him Shekois, Chachmu Chachmasu Mistalekes Mimenu, Naviu Nevuasu Mistalekes Mimenu. Says Rish Lakish that if a person gets angry, well, if he's a Chacham, if he's a wise person, he's going to lose his wisdom. If he's a prophet, he's going to lose his prophecy. How do we know that if he's a Chacham, he's going to lose his wisdom? Moshe. From Moshe, that Moshe got upset at the soldiers. That this was after the battle of Midian, and the soldiers left alive the women and children, and they took a whole bunch of spoils and stuff. And Moshe Rabbeinu got upset. And it says, that then Elazar HaKohen had to say to the people in the army that were coming to fight, this is the laws regarding purifying vessels from Tumah and stuff. So we see that Moshe forgot the halacha, or it was hidden from him. So we see that Moshe got upset, and then all of a sudden we see Elazar teaching halacha and not Moshe. And if this person is a prophet, so then he will lose his prophecy. Elisha, you know this from the prophet Elisha. It says, that Yehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and Jehoram, the king of Israel, came together to fight. I think it was against the Plishtim, maybe? I don't remember. But Elisha gets up in front of Yehoshaphat and Jehoram, and he says to Jehoram, if not for the fact that Yehoshaphat was here, I wouldn't even look at your direction. So we see that he got upset. And it says, V'ata k'chuli minagen. Elisha says, if for me to prophesize, get me a musician. And it was when the musician played that he then got prophecy. So we see that because he got upset, he lost his prophecy, and he had to get worked up again with a musician. Amr Rab Mani bar Patish, afilu poskin olav gedulim and hashamayim moridin also. Interesting. Somebody who gets upset, even if greatness was meant to be for him, the Eibishter is going to undo his greatness. Let's see. Minalan, how do we know this? Me Eliav, from David HaMelech's oldest brother Eliav. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Vayicha af Eliav b'David, that when David went to the battlefield, when Goliath was over there, so his brother Eliav got upset at him. Vayomer, and Eliav said, Lama zayu'adta, how come you came? Va'amina tashta ma'atatzon, and with who did you leave the sheep that you're supposed to be watching? Hahena b'midbar, in the desert. Ani yadati es zidoncha v'esroel levavecha, I, Eliav, know your, sort of negative intentions. You just came here to see action. So we see that Eliav got upset at David HaMelech. And we see that when Shmuel came to anoint one of the children of Yishai as a king, by each one of the children it says, no, the Eibishter does not choose this one. But specifically by Eliav it says, Vayomer Shem Shmuel, Al Tabit Al Mareu, V'Agba Komaso, Ki Ma'astiu. That God says to Shmuel, don't look at his appearance and at his height, because I have, decided that I don't want him to be king. Implying that no, until now, he was the top candidate. Meaning all the other children, she says, no, God isn't interested. Eliav doesn't say that God's not interested. He says, God says, I'm not interested. Well, wait, what? Isn't that the same thing? No, but the point being that it isn't just a hand wave by Eliav like all the other children. God says, you know what? I'm actually not interested. As if he's just making up his mind right now that up until now, Eliav really was supposed to be the king. But because we see, and actually this thing with Goliath was actually later. This hadn't happened yet at the time that Shmuel came. But the point is that since Eliav was this kind of person that gets upset, so God says, you know what? It's not going to work. And David ended up being the chosen one. Interesting. Alright, interesting stuff about getting angry, getting haughty. Now back to shtickle like Gemara-y kind of things, just for a few lines. Ashkachan Tamru Pesach Didachu Shabbos Didachu Tuma Minalan. Interesting. So we see that the Korban Tamid and the Korban Pesach are Docha Shabbos. We saw you can offer them on Shabbos. How do we know that they're even Docha Tuma? That if the majority of Israel is Tmei Meis, is become Tamei from a corpse, so if the majority of Israel has Tumas Sameis, so you can nonetheless go ahead and bring the Korban Tamid. You could go ahead and bring the Korban Pesach. So how do we know this? So Amri Keichid Yalav Pesach Mitamid Linin Shabbos Hachinami Yalav Tamid Mi Pesach Linin Tuma. So just like we learn out the Korban Pesach from the Korban Tamid to learn that it's Docha Shabbos, it's just like the Korban Tamid is Docha Shabbos. So that's how we know that the Korban Pesach is Docha Shabbos. So now say the opposite when it comes to Tuma. That just like we know that the Korban Pesach it can be offered if the majority of Israel is Tameh, so also the Korban Tamid is the same. Ufesach Gufei Minalan. How do we know? I don't know if I skipped, but we're in the middle of the second wide line. Ufesach Gufei Minalan. How do we know that the Korban Pesach itself can be offered if people are if the majority of Israel is Tameh, specifically Tmei Meis? So Amar Yochanan to Amar Kra. Yochanan says, because the pasuk says Ish ki Tamei lanefesh, that in individual, right, in the context of Pesach Sheni is that if you have individual people, it says Ish, individuals. If you have individuals who are Tameh when Pesach rolls around, so they can bring the Pesach Sheni. So they cannot bring the Korban Pesach, but a month later they bring the Pesach Sheni offering. So Ish nitche le Pesach Sheni vein tzibur nitche le Pesach Sheni. So individuals who are Tameh get pushed off to Pesach Sheni, but if you have the majority of Am Yisrael Tmei Meis, so then they do not wait a month and offer the Korban Pesach a month later. Ela avdei b'tumah, rather you just offer the Korban Pesach when you're Tameh, in that case when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis. Reb Shimon ben Lakish says to Reb Yochanan, maybe that's not a good proof from that pasuk. Eima ish nidche le Pesach Sheni. Rish Lakish says, I can argue, no, while I agree with you that an individual brings the Korban Pesach a month later at Pesach Sheni if he's Tameh, but Tzibur leis lu takanta lo Pesach Rishon, lo Pesach Sheni. But says Rish Lakish, I can make the argument that while an individual will be pushed off to Pesach Sheni, the entire congregation wouldn't bring the Korban Pesach bichlal. Not just that they could bring the Pesach Rishon, but they don't bring it at all. Rather, Rish Lakish says, how do we know that if the majority of the congregation is Tameh, that they bring the Pesach Rishon? From here, so the pasuk says that we have to send out of the camp, and we're going to see tomorrow that there's different camps for each type of tumah. But it says, they have to throw out of the camp anybody who has tsaras, anybody who's a zav, anybody who's tmei nefesh. You have to throw them out of the camp. So Yomar tmei mesim val Yomar zav and mitzorayin. V'anu omer tmei mesim mishtachin zav and mitzorayin lo kol shekin. So Rish Lakish says, I don't understand why the pasuk has to say all three things. I don't understand why the pasuk has to say Zav and Mitzorah and Tmei Meis. How about this? Zav and Mitzorah are more stringent than Tmei Meis. So if you tell me that just Tmei Meis needs to be thrown out of the encampments, well then I'll know Memela that if a Tmei Meis is thrown out of the encampment, so then certainly Zav and Mitzorah are going to be thrown out of the encampment. So why do we have to list all three? So Ella, because it would not be enough to just say Tmei Meis, because because there are situations where a Tmei Meis does not need to be thrown out of the camp, and he's allowed to remain, yet a Zav and a Mitzorah would have to be thrown out of the camp. So if we would only say in the pasuk Tmei Meis, so while in most situations, you can learn that, well, if a Tmei Meis is thrown out of the camp, then certainly Zav and Mitzorah. But there are going to be situations where a Tmei Meis is actually allowed to remain in the camp. And if we only had Tmei Meis in the pasuk, I would think that the same would apply to Zav and Mitzorah. Therefore, we have to say Tmei Mace and Zav and Mitzora, so that even in situations where Tmei Mace can remain in the camp, the Zav and the Mitzora still have to go. Ve'ezazeh, what's this mysterious case where the Tmei Mace can stay? Pesach haba b'tumah, that is a korban Pesach which is offered b'tumah, i.e., says Rish Lakish, that must be referring to when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mace, and they can offer the korban Pesach b'tumah. So we see that in that case, even Tmei Mace are able to go into the Azara. Masha'en Kain Zav Mitzora, that would not apply to Zav Mitzora, that if the majority of Am Yisrael is Zavs or Mitzoras, they would not bring the korban Pesach b'tumah. It's only Tmei Mace. Alright, well, that was Daf Samach Vav of Masechta Pesachim. There was some really interesting stuff on this daf, I think. Right, the story of how Hillel became the nasi. We learned so many interesting things in that story. We learned about these Bnei Beseira, who they were. They were these very early family in Jerusalem around the time of Hillel and Shmaya and Avtalyon. They were a very prominent family. They didn't know a certain halacha. That is how Hillel Habavli became the nasi in Eretz Yisrael. Some interesting Agadatas about, if you're haughty or if you're angry, if you're a wise person, you will lose your wisdom. If you're a prophet, you will lose your prophecy. And at the end we discussed Pesach sheni, that if you have an individual who is tameh when Pesach rolls around, so you can bring the korban Pesach a month later at Pesach sheni. The question is, what about a congregation? What if the majority of the congregation is Tmei Mace? So Rabbi Yochanan says, we learn out from the pasuk, it says ish in the context of Pesach sheni, implying that it applies to individuals, but a community would be pushed off to Pesach sheni. An individual would be pushed off to Pesach sheni, but the community would just offer the korban regularly. And Rish Lakish says you can't learn it out from that pasuk, but from this other pasuk of Vishalchu min hamachne kol tzaruch v'chozav v'chotamid lenefesh, that we learn out from there that if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mace, they can nonetheless bring the korban Pesach. That was Daf Samach Vav. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Have a great day. Peace.